started? Yeah, I think so.
All right, let's do it. Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Debbie Goldberg. I'm the Chief Philanthropic Officer for the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. And I am thrilled to be presenting along with Meredith, our CEO, Spotlight #1, the CEO+CPO partnership plus campaign cadence plus data mastery equals greater excellence. Did you guys follow that? It's a lot of pluses, right? And it's a lot of math. And like, you know, it's a weird math formula here, but I promise you that we'll get to something worthwhile. So here's what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes. We're going to talk about the CEO-CPO relationship for problem solving. We're going to talk about data diligence, and then we're going to actually talk about a case study, which is Rochester, and how we were able to utilize data to impact our campaign. And finally, we'll open it up because we want this to be a discussion, and we wanted to hear from all of you about how you're using data or about the relationship that you have with your CPO or CDO or CEO. That's where we'll go. At the end of this, it's really our hope that to give you an example of how you can use data to help you solve a problem. And that's really the focus of this session. So with that, I'm going to pass it to our CEO, Meredith Dragon.
Thanks, Debbie. So as Debbie said, I'm the CEO in Rochester, New York. And hopefully you were on this morning listening to Rabbi Gelfand. If you didn't, I suggest going back and listening to her presentation. It was short and it was really meaningful because she talked about stories and the stories we tell. And in particular, she talked about the stories that we love to share and the stories that are true and how we share them. So today, the story about our data is a story that we love to tell because it's so important and it's been so impactful in our community. And it's a story that's true. So, you know, it's not made up, which is fantastic. It's also uniquely a Rochester story. And, you know, I don't know if this story resonates necessarily in your communities, but what we're hoping for is that the idea of using data, even simple data, to make decisions can greatly impact all of the work that you're doing and not just your fundraising. But I think there's a lesson in here, probably for similar size communities, maybe smaller communities, maybe larger communities as well. Just to set the stage a little bit, I've been the CEO in Rochester for about 6.5 years. And when I started in April of 2016. And when I walked in the door, I've always, as a CEO, fundraising, donor, cultivation, stewardship, development has always been an important part of my work. And when I started and I wanted to know where the campaign was, I discovered that we hadn't really even raised 50% of our campaign yet, and we close on June 30th. That's the end of our fiscal year. So there wasn't much time to close the campaign. And it was awkward and it was a little uncomfortable because I followed somebody in this role who'd been here for 30 years, who had very deep community relationships. And my preference would have been to walk in the door and simply meet with our donors and get a handle on the community and figure out what the most important issues were. And yet I found myself in a situation where I needed to close a lot of gifts very quickly. And as I joke with Debbie, I don't ever like to kiss on the first date, but I really don't ever like to ask for money on the first date. You know, it's just good to have a good relationship, get to know you. So I wasn't necessarily even sitting down and having meetings with people right in the beginning. I mean, I did, but I was calling donors and introducing myself and saying, this is not how I want this to be. And can I make an appointment to meet with you? And can we close your gift right now? Fortunately, people responded really well, but it sort of began to shine a light on a challenge that we had in that we were closing a lot of our campaign without the relationship building and the stewardship that's needed. And we were doing it later and later in the year. And this was coupled with other challenges that we needed to address at the same time. But as a new CEO walking in the door, one of the other things that I really needed to do and that I wanted to do was to work to build trust among our staff with me. There were a lot of folks who'd been in positions for a long time. To identify issues together that needed to be addressed and to prioritize how to address them. And then I always, with all of our staff, I really believe that it's important to empower our staff to do the jobs that they've been hired to do and to give them the training and the skills to do those jobs. And I would add that probably next to finance, the most important relationship that we as CEOs have is with our either CDOs or CPOs, because they are the ones who are working in partnership with us to raise the dollars that support our community, dollars locally and overseas, and our institution, and our priorities and organizational goals. And I can't tell you how many times I hear from CDOs in particular that they have a hard time working with their CEO. So it was important to me to develop a strong working relationship with our CPO to understand that we are really in this together. We both have roles to play, different roles, but to empower and support and ensure that our CPO could do the work that needed to get done to continue to not only raise the dollars, but to increase and to grow our fundraising efforts. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Debbie.
Great, thanks, Meredith. I could just tell you from my perspective, I've worked for the Federation for 12 years and I've worked with Meredith for 6. And it's been such a breath of fresh air to work with Meredith. She encourages creativity. She listens, and there's a tremendous amount of trust there. And it's been really remarkable to see how much growth we've had in the past 6 years. And it's really working. So it's a delight. We're grateful that you came to Rochester, Meredith.
Thank you.
So with that, I want to move on and I want to talk about the data. The relationship, I really value the relationship with Meredith, and that's a tremendous resource, but certainly data is also a tremendous resource. So I want to get into the data intelligence. In preparation for today, I was researching, the first thing I researched was data on data. Like, what data can I share about data? But like, it seemed a little bit redundant. And I can just tell you that there's a lot of data on data. But I instead opted for a quote instead of presenting some data. And there were a lot of quotes out there, but I really enjoyed this one. I thought that this one really resonated with me. You can't improve what you don't measure. So certainly in the realm of our work and what we're doing, we're always trying to improve. Even if we have a good year this year, we know next year we want to be able to improve. And the data is just such an important part of that success. So I think everybody on this call understands why data is important. I mean, these are some of the reasons. Obviously, I think that it's just understood why data is important. I think that the challenge is that oftentimes we are inundated with data and there is so much data available, right, that we don't know which data to use to help solve the problem. By the way, sometimes the data is the problem, right? When I mentioned that we had issues with data integrity in our last session, like sometimes that is the problem. It is the data is the source of the problem. But I think that it would be so helpful to talk to you about a real life scenario of like how we were able to utilize data to better our campaign and our work in general. And I think that that's really, again, we could talk about why data is important and we could talk about benchmarks and baselines, but I'd rather show you. So I'd like to be able to share our story with you. So in order to be able to understand our story, you have to know a little bit about the Rochester community. So these are the only things. There's a lot to know about the Rochester community, and I'm happy to jump on a call with anybody here to tell you all about the Rochester community at some other time. But for today, the only things that I really need for you to know are, one, we're a community of 18,000 Jews. So that's not particularly large, right? We hover around $4.5 million for the annual campaign. We're part of the large intermediate cohorts. We're on a fiscal calendar. That's really important to remember as we talk about the timing of people's gifts. It's important to know that we're on the fiscal year. So we're running July 1 to June 30th. Our community is an incredible, strong connection to Israel. And just in general, this is a very, very special community. It's very, very intimate. Everybody knows one another. Some would describe it as insular, but I think it's a very, very warm, wonderful place to be. And the Federation has a very, very important role in the Jewish community. It is really considered the premier Jewish organization that is here. And there's a lot of trust and faith that the community has placed within the Federation. So again, there's a lot of other things about Rochester that I want to share. I see you, Meredith, you want to say something?
Yeah, just a quick thing. Someone asked in the last session, how many donors are there within that 4.5 million? So it's about It's about 1,700 households. We count household giving. It's probably about 3,000 donors, 1,700 households that represent the $4.5 million, in case anybody is curious.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. So in order to understand our story, now that I've told you about the community, in order to understand the story, I have to take you back in time. And I'm going to take you back to a dreaded time. And that time is March 2020, right? So if you think back as to where you were, what you were doing in March 2020, you know that COVID came. And I'm sure we all have COVID stories, right? But that's really the start of this story that I'm about to share with you with data. So like everybody else, when COVID came, we had no idea what to expect. Meredith had the foresight to know that this was very, very bad. I mean, we knew it was bad, but we just didn't really understand how bad it was. So when COVID came, the first thing that we did was launch an emergency campaign, right? We had the foresight immediately, literally, like our office shut down, I think on the 15th. And by the 16th, we had an emergency campaign in place. We raised $700,000. The second thing that we did was we helped our JCC. They were in dire straits they were already in bad shape. And when the JCC had to close, all of their revenue streams were shut off, and they really, really needed help. And literally, Meredith deployed me to work for the JCC so we can launch an emergency campaign for them because they needed the help and the situation was so dire. The third thing that we did, which is really significant and the most significant in the context of this conversation, is we paused the annual campaign. It's never happened in the history of the Rochester Federation. We have never stopped campaigning. We have had months where they've been slower than others, but we have never, ever, ever stopped. And we stopped because it was the right thing to do at that time. And basically, we took a 2-month break. I would say we shut down the office March 15th, around there. I would say that it was the end of May, right around the last week in May, where we made the decision that we had to resume our work with the annual campaign and that we had to give it a try and that we just needed to go back to it. And that was controversial, but we really felt like that was the right decision. The challenge is that when we revisited the campaign, we realized we were in trouble. And that is because less than 50% of the campaign had been closed. And now it was the end of May. We only had 1 month to close the campaign. It was a very, very scary situation. We really didn't know what would happen. That said, we hustled, we rallied, we used all the resources we have, and thankfully, we dodged the bullet. We were able to close 96% of the campaign by June 30th, right?
Debbie, if I can add one quick thing too, in that time, we also raised well over $700,000 for COVID relief. And Debbie helped the JCC raise $2.5 million for their emergency efforts. So within that time, in those 2 months in the community, we raised well over $3 million. Obviously, none of it had anything to do with the annual campaign, but it was about addressing immediate needs in the community.
Right. It's a good point. Thank you, Meredith. Right. It's not like we were sitting around doing nothing, but we were raising money. But that said, at that point, at May, the annual campaign was at a precarious position. So we dodged the bullet, and it wasn't until I could catch my breath right around July that I said, how the heck did that happen? I don't understand how we were in such a vulnerable position as a community, and I didn't even know it. I mean, I always suspected that I could feel that with every campaign, there seemed to be more dollars out at the end than the year before, but I didn't really know how bad it was until I started to delve into the data. And this is what I discovered. So this is our story, right? It's a sad story, right? What you're looking at is annual campaign gifts that are closed by December 31st, going from 1995 to 2020. And what you can see is that when we start in 1995, about 78% of the annual campaign gifts were closed by December 31st. And then when you look at 2020, at the low point, it was 36%, right? So we knew at that point that we had an issue. We knew at that point that people were making gifts at the end of the campaign, not in the fall when we really needed them to make the campaign. And this created two problems for us. The first is that we do our allocations in May, okay? So it never seemed to make sense to me that I'm fundraising until June, but they're allocating in May, right? We have a timing issue here. It doesn't make any sense. Some years the projections work. In a year like 2020, the projection was completely off because everybody went into panic mode, right? And so we had to project on a campaign that wasn't at all closed. So that's a challenge, the allocation as that we do in May. The second is that it's totally.
One other quick thing, and we significantly under allocated because we projected low because we really weren't sure how we were going to do. We ended up doing significantly better than we expected. We had more dollars to give away the following year because we raised the money and we hadn't allocated it, and it was a problem.
Right, under allocated is never a good thing, right? Finally we learned, we know that giving at the end of June is totally inconsistent with the way that the average person makes their gift, right? Like we know most people make their gift at the end of the year, not at the end of June. On June 30th, nobody is thinking about the Federation. People are giving. Most people are thinking about vacation, college graduation, but they're not thinking about Federation. So being on that fiscal year puts us already at a disadvantage because it's inconsistent with the way that we know that people give. So we made a decision at that point in time that we are not going to let this happen again. And we made a decision then that in 2021, we were going to close the campaign on May 30th, not June 30th. And we decided that having 1 month extra, if we close it in May, at the time, we were looking at this wonderful scenario that we would have 1 extra month to plan, to steward, to cultivate, to do all the things that we don't have time to do in a campaign year. So that was the decision that we made. And, summer happened, and right around October, the first week in October, the second week in October, I happened to be having a conversation with a wonderful creative man named Tony Labriola. He works outside of New York. He's incredibly creative. And I was telling him how some of my needs for the 2021 year, and one of those was the need to communicate with our donors because we're going to close the campaign on May 30th. We've never done that before. This is going to be new to the community. And how can I make sure that the donors know? Because I'm really worried that they're just going to make their gift on June 30th or July 15th or June 45th, but it's not going to come in by May 30th. So without missing a beat, Tony said, well, let me ask you a question. Why don't you do something called the 80-80 challenge? Why don't you challenge the community to raise 80% of your campaign in the last 80 days of the calendar year? And I said, great. Wow, that sounds interesting. And so we had a few conversations. The first conversation I had with was the campaign chair, who said, this is never going to happen. Like, there's no way we're going to be able to close 80% of the campaign by the end of the year. I'll support it because that's my job as the campaign chair, but there's no way. She felt like we were setting ourselves up for failure. The next conversation was with Meredith, and I don't want to speak for you, Meredith. However,
so Debbie came to me to do an 80-80 challenge. And I think we were on day 78. We should have already started 2 days prior. And I really wanted to close the campaign earlier. And Debbie was being very generous by saying we closed the campaign on June 30th. But there was sort of like this joke in Rochester that we closed the campaign on June 45th, which sometimes was July 15th and sometimes was August 15th. I mean, we were closing the campaign as we were getting ready to launch a new campaign, and we're just not big enough to do that, in my opinion. So when Debbie came to me, I really had in my head, I thought, there's no way we're going to get this done. We're already 2 days late. We haven't launched. It's the middle still of a pandemic, and it's never going to work. However, with going back to what I said earlier about the CEO+CPO relationship, Debbie came to me and felt very strongly about this. And I thought, well, what have we got to lose? We can give it a try. And as I said earlier, I really like to empower our staff to do the things and to be creative and to do the things that we need to do to get things done. Debbie felt strongly about it, and she wanted to do it. So I thought, well, I'm going to support it. We'll give it a try. And I kept my thoughts to myself because I really didn't think it was going to work. However, I'll let Debbie finish the story.
Right. So the end of the story, right, is that it worked. It was a good ending. And in 2021, we closed 84% of our campaign by December 31st. And in 2022, we closed 94% of the campaign by 2022. So we changed the story. This is what our logo looked like, by the way, for the 80/80 challenge. And this is what the story is. I mean, we're still in the story right now, but as you can see here, right, you can see the green is where we started. That's 1995. The heart is where Meredith came, by the way. The lightning bolt is that March 2020 when COVID came and struck us all. And finally, the smiley face is where we are right now. And you can see just the trajectory of what's happened as a result of closing those campaign gifts. But really, it doesn't just stop with the fundraising. Although I do believe that it's, a lot of important things happen within the fundraising realm, because what happened is that we knew it was important to do it. We didn't necessarily know why. And now we've gotten to experience both worlds, right? We've experienced this world where we have a very, very, very long campaign. It's super stressful in June, and we're running around crazy, dialing for dollars, trying to get everything in. And now with planning and strategy, it's a totally different world. So what's happened is that because so much of the campaign has been closed in October, November, December, we now are able to use January, February, March, and April as we're using it for planning. We're using it to steward our donors. We're using it to cultivate our donors. We're using it to relax. This year, I went on a vacation in July. It was honestly the first extended vacation that I've had in the 12 years that I've worked for a federation. Most importantly, it cleared the way for us to be successful with the Ukraine campaign. So by the time Ukraine happened, we had already closed 94% of our campaign. So we were in a very, very good position. Our fair share for Ukraine, I think, was $140,000. Our community said, absolutely not. We're going to raise way more than that. And in the end, they raised $1 million for Ukraine. It was remarkable. And I believe that we would not have been able to do that if the annual campaign was if we were still stuck in our other way, if the annual campaign was still as active as it was in years prior. Closing that campaign enabled us to have the time, energy, strength, and resolve to focus on other things, whether that be Ukraine or what are the other things that I mentioned earlier. So I'm happy to share this. This, by the way, is a slide of our annual campaign.
Debbie, can we go back for a second? Because there are two things that I really wanted to add. One is that, as Debbie mentioned, we hit 94% this past year. It actually would have been higher. We have one major donor. It's a gift that's annually anywhere between $150,000 to $300,000, depending on what we're raising money for. So had that gift closed, we would have been much closer to 100%. So, the 94 doesn't quite tell the whole story. The other piece is, as much as I had said in the prior year, I didn't think it was going to resonate. Several folks asked us, how did you market this? Because it wasn't a story about, where the dollars go and the impact of the dollars. It was really like an internal challenge that we had in wanting to be able to do our work better. So we had a pretty significant marketing campaign around the 80/80 challenge that we were very open and honest with our community to say, this isn't working and we're trying to fix something that we know is broken. And the reason why we want to fix it is because we want to be more effective, we want to be more efficient, and we want to be able to meet the needs of the community. And believe it or not, that message resonated so much in 2021 that we did get to the 84%. But even more so, this past year in 2022, it was astonishing to me that people remembered the 80/80 challenge, and they just assumed that we were doing it again. And we would, have donor conversations, and they'd say, of course, we're going to make our pledge now. We know you want to hit that 80% so that you can use the dollars most effectively. So sometimes the story is about the data and about the use of the dollars for the benefit of the community. Never in a million years did I actually think that message would resonate, but it did. And it resonated enough that we didn't have to remind people the following year. It was so much easier this past year to close the 94% than it had been the year before, because the message really struck an important chord in the prior year. And so much so that for this year, we actually aren't doing the 80/80 challenge. What we've decided is that we are doing a 100-day challenge. to close 100% of the campaign by December 31st. So it just so happens that 100 days begins the Friday before Rosh Hashanah, which is a great time to launch the campaign. And our goal really is to close 100% of the campaign by December 31st, which then gives us time to work on a whole variety of things that we've been spending a lot of time on, like reevaluating our planning and allocations process, determining how we're giving away the money, and really editing that whole distribution process. It gives us time to work more closely with our partner agencies around issues that are of concern in the community. It's given us time to develop new donor relationships that we haven't been able to before. It gives us time to sit down and talk to our donors about what we're doing and why, and not ask for a gift, which is refreshing. We've had a whole new stewardship plan that we've been able to launch during that time that our board members have really been actively engaged in. We've been able to do some new programming and planning, as Debbie mentioned. We've also cleared the way for our partner agencies to be able to do some of the work they need to do in fundraising and not to be stepping on each other's toes. And I don't want to diminish the role of self-care, but we all work really hard out in the field, and it's really important to be able to take care of ourselves. And Debbie wasn't kidding about her vacation. And, if we are constantly in this turmoil of closing the campaign, even when you're on vacation, you're still thinking about what needs to be done in the realm of fundraising. And really, it made it so much easier for our finance department. We were gone, we weren't raising money. Our finance department actually got caught up. They could catch their breath. And it just allowed us to do our work in a way that we had told the community wanted to, which was effectively and efficiently. And that really matters in our world. It matters for our partner agencies. It matters for our donors. And there's such a long runway now to be able to go back and actually do some supplemental asks, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's our security effort that we've been raising money for many years, or supplemental programs. There have been all kinds of things that we've raised money for outside the annual campaign that has allowed us to continue to do the work of federation in a much greater capacity within the community, and really to solidify the role of federation in the community as not only fundraiser, but community builder and tackling the most important issues. And I really don't believe we would have gotten to many of those things had we not gotten out of the cycle that we were in. Eileen, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. It's it's very specific practical question.
Yeah.
But I don't want to interrupt your, I just want to put it out there that I have a question. I don't want to interrupt your flow.
No,
Okay. Well, you know what?
Question.
We'll probably be done in just a couple minutes, and we'll
Okay.
have 10 minutes at the end for questions and comments.
Yep.
Great. Perfect.
So what the slide that you're looking at here is just our annual campaign. And the next slide will show you our total campaign, our total FRD effort through all of our campaigns. And so as you can see, that's the yellow line, by the way. The yellow line is the total FRD, and the purple line is the annual campaign. So you can just see the growth that we've had in the past 2, 3, 4 years. By the way, if you look at 2017, I would say, actually it's 2018. 2018 was the first year that we started to adapt or understand what a total FRD model was, but we didn't really have anything to add to it. And since Meredith has been here, we've been able to really diversify what we're offering to our donors. And you can see here, by the way, it says 6.1, the number is actually 6.2. We're doing a good job with our total FRD effort. I'm really, really proud of the total dollars that were raised. That said, I do not believe we would have been able to handle the other campaigns without taking care of our bread and butter, and that is the annual campaign. The annual campaign is our bread and butter. And so this is the end of the story. It's a good ending, right? And it never would have happened had we not looked at the data and really evaluated where we were, and enabled the data to be part of the solution. So
one other quick thing about that data too is what's not on there are the endowment dollars that we've raised. We have an integrated foundation. And we have done exponentially better in foundation giving because we've had time to raise some foundation dollars. It was probably another $2 or $3 million that we raised last year in our foundation. So if you really look at total financial resource development and include the foundation, the numbers are exponentially higher, and we've given ourselves the time to do that too.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. All right, I feel like I would love to hear from all of you. I really want to know how you're using data, what your challenges are with the data. Do you have a specific problem that data can help solve? Is data your problem? And I'd love to open the floor to hear from all of you.
Or have you not thought about the data you need to answer, to answer a problem? And Eileen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I can say something about, I mean, we are learning to use our data. And so I don't really have that much to add to that. We are on a fairly similar schedule. We have a September 1 start date to our campaign, and the campaign goes through until we make our allocations decisions or we approve them in May. We still actually do end up taking in some funds between May and August, and we often, we take that into consideration. We have a what ifs when we make our allocations decisions. But so right now, we are starting our 2023 annual community campaign. So my question to you is, what campaign did you just kick off and are hoping to have completed? Is it your 22 or your 23? Because it's the language for us, we're going to have, I love this idea for all of the reasons that you talked about. And we have a similar thing where we're scrounging, in May, but we're kicking off 23, which is also confusing sometimes for people who give in the latter half, right, of 22, because then they're like, oh, they're asking again in the fall of 2022. So I'm curious, like, what's your campaign's name and how did you get people to sort of readjust?
It's such a good question. Debbie and I talk about this all the time. We are launching our 23 campaign, and it is. Yeah, we are. It's the 2023 campaign that will be done before we actually start the calendar year of 2023.
Nice. Okay,
it's a little ridiculous, and we try to explain it. People are confused. They will continue to be confused. We try to explain that it's called the 23 campaign because it's our 2023 fiscal year. We're allocating the dollars for 2023. It really doesn't make any sense. But it's a problem that started, nearly 90 years ago when we run the campaigns.
Sure.
And I know that we're going to fix it. So we try to talk about the annual campaign and try not to focus too much on the year. And we try to share the message and the story of what we're raising the money for, and not necessarily the year, because it's confusing.
But if most people are giving before the end of the calendar year, you have actually a lot fewer confused people giving in the second half of the calendar year, and then the first half, of the new calendar year, and wondering what's going on. So it's actually could be, I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that one of the things that, I don't know if it's feasible for us to switch to a calendar year. I don't know how that would ever happen. Either we'd have to have like a 6-month campaign or an 18-month campaign. I mean, it would be very difficult to transition to a calendar year, even though my preference would be, because then we're consistent with the way that people live their lives. I think that there's a lot of confusing things about Federation giving in general. We've created a very confusing process, starting with the fact that we're on a fiscal year, not a calendar year. We've got joint giving, we've got women's giving. We have a totally different pledge process from a payment process. So people can't keep track of when they made the pledge. If they made the pledge in one calendar year, but they're paying it in another one, how we're reporting it. We've created a very, very, very confusing system. And I think what I've learned in this process, that the easier we can make it for the donor, the better.
Haley?
Yes, I was just curious to know, with this, with the benefits that you've seen from the 80 and 80, can you talk a little bit about what happens in the spring? And you mentioned you do a lot of planning and preparation. Can you just share a little bit more detail about what happens in that off season? Because that time for planning just sounds so amazingly beautiful.
It was. So there are a lot of things that we did in the spring, and we were just as busy. We were just busy with other things. But one of the pieces that we tackled that began in late January, early February was a very deep dive into our allocations process. And we completely revamped our allocations process, which will be launching this year. And we had the time to actually reevaluate our planning and allocations. That was a big piece. We had time to have donor meetings that were really about just conversations and getting to know our donors better. We had time to plan for the 2023 campaign and to look at the data, where we were, where we'd like to be, and to identify potential. We had time to talk about new donors potentially, and people that we want to highlight in the community that want to spend some time with. Like Debbie said, we had time. I still haven't taken a vacation, but that's on me. Debbie had time to take vacation, but there are several initiatives. We've been working very closely with our partner agencies, with other local funders and foundations, to talk about priorities, the community challenges that we have, how we want to work on joint funding with our foundations. We actually just launched this summer an RFP in partnership with local foundations to do some joint funding that we worked on in the late winter and spring as well. So, I mean, these are really important community initiatives that we've gotten to that we probably would have tried to do at the same time and just not had enough bandwidth. And there, it's really important, Federation's role in the community as a community builder. And I think we often say we're a community builder, and yet we don't necessarily create the time and the space to put those best practices into use. And this, I think, will continue to allow us to do that, in particular, especially if we get to 100%. We weren't quite at 100%, so we still had some fundraising going on, particularly from, that one large gift. But it was much less. And one of the things we didn't talk about is we actually had a net gain in donors this year for a whole different set of reasons, but also using data. And I do believe actually some of that net gain was because of the timing that changed.
Haley, also, we have a lot of other campaigns in play. So I'm talking, the 80/80 challenge was specific to the annual campaign. At the same time, we have a Rock Strong campaign, which is our security initiative. We have something called the Levine Center to End Hate, which is a program that's addressing hate. We had Ukraine this year. So we are actively Rock Strong. The nice thing about it is that, ideally we have this conversation about, like, we'd love to have an integrated ask. It makes us much more efficient if we could just have one conversation with our donors. But one thing that I'm learning is just because we're ready to have that and we're ready to do that doesn't mean that the donor's ready to do that. So there's a very small cadre of donors where you could really have a meaningful integrated ask conversation. By and large, everybody else, an overwhelming majority of our donors, they just want to make their gift to the annual campaign. And it's okay for us to go back to have a different conversation. But like for now, for the annual campaign, the 80/80 challenge is really just strictly about the annual campaign. It's not about having that integrated ask. It just isn't.
Yeah, I would also add about the integrated ask is that, we really do rely on many of our lay leaders to do our fundraising, particularly with some of our most significant donors. And our solicitors, our lay leaders, they're not, other than maybe doing an endowment or legacy ask, they're not comfortable with the integrated ask. We, I think, as the campaign professionals, are able to do it and to do it fairly successfully. But for the most part, our volunteers, they just don't pivot, and they're willing to ask 3 different times at different times of the year, and they are wonderful solicitors. But the integrated ask, even we've done integrated ask training, they're just not getting there and they're not doing it. So rather than trying to fight it, we've taken a different tack.
Thank you. That all resonates and on all of those topics. So I really appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
No problem.
By the way, I forgot to mention, I think the first year we did this in 2021, we had a match. We had an anonymous match. And so it was phrased that we challenged the community. If we could close 80% of the campaign in the last 80 days of the calendar year, that we would get an additional $80,000.
It was our match, Debbie. We created the fund.
I know it was it was the Farish money that we used. We were going to get it anyway, but like if you can find a match, the community loves matches. They'll respond. That could make it a challenge like the 80/80 challenge
that much more, that you'll get a greater response. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Or challenges that you have that you want to talk through? I just want to reiterate where we began, which is the importance of the relationship between CEO and CPO. Debbie and I have a really close working relationship, and it's been I can't emphasize enough that much of the success really is because of our the internal strength that we have and how we build off of each other and support each other. And I don't think any of these issues can be tackled without that kind of relationship. It's integral to the work that we're doing. And if there are situations where you're having trouble with the relationship CEO, CDO, CPO, it's really important to fix that, because the trust in this is the backbone of our organization. This enables us to do all the other work that we do. And if it's not working for some reason, it's one of the most important pieces to fix, because the impact on the community of not having a strong relationship here is significant. And I'm very, very grateful for Debbie and her hard work, her creativity, all the things that she brings to me all the time, and the ability that she has really to implement things like the 80/80 challenge and otherwise. So Debbie, thank you.
Thank you. So nice. You're gonna make me cry.
It's true. It's true.
Very nice. Thank you. And on that note also, it's obviously having this wonderful relationship with Meredith is a tremendous resource, and the data is also a resource, but you are also a resource. And I can't tell you how often I leave our CDO call and I'm like, oh, that is definitely something that we should be focusing on. It wasn't on my radar, but in this community, they had success with X, Y, or Z. So you are also a wonderful resource. I want to continue to be a resource for you. I don't always make it to the CDO calls, and not all of you are in the large intermediate cohort, but I'm available if you have questions about anything that we covered today. If you have questions about Rochester, community, data, Meredith, whatever it may be, reach out. We're here. We're here to help.
For sure.
Okay.
Thank you all.